Hello. This lecture will contrast structured literacy from a balanced literacy approach, and will discuss the importance of choosing instructional materials that are aligned with the science of reading. In the Dr. Tolman videos you watched, she discussed her hourglass figure as a helpful way to illustrate the early pathway to mastering print. She connected this to the four-part processor. She focused on the development of word recognition skills. Moats reminds us that, quote, early phonological skills, letter knowledge, and sound symbol matching may be priorities in kindergarten, but at the same time, vocabulary and oral language growth must be deliberately nurtured both explicitly and implicitly, end quote, page 260. Both parts of the reading rope are crucial from the beginning of instruction throughout development. Chapter 8 in Speech to Print nicely outlines the instructional goals and how these change across skill development and phases of development. On page 255 in her text, Speech to Print, Dr. Moats contrasts structured literacy versus typical instruction along a number of different variables that are really crucial and illustrate the differences between a structured literacy approach and a more typical approach that's currently being used in school. This may be considered a balanced literacy approach. The two approaches differ on crucial characteristics of instruction. Key differences can be seen in the organization of foundational reading skills. For example, a structured literacy approach has a clear scope and sequence of phonological and phonics skills, outlining their progression from easier to more difficult. And a typical literature approach would have an organization based around the comprehension of a book or a literature theme. Phonological awareness in phonics is not prioritized and do not follow a logical sequence. Another characteristic is around the texts that are used for reading instruction. In a structured approach, the texts for instruction focus on decodables, things that can be decoded based on the skills that have been taught. In a typical literature approach, leveled texts are what is primarily used for instruction and is not controlled by the phonics skill. The two approaches also differ in terms of content, how instructional time is used, and the role of the teacher. All of these are key differences, but I want to draw your attention to how instructional time is used. In a structural literacy approach, equal time is given to word recognition and language comprehension in K1, but in 2nd through 4th grade, more time is given to language comprehension, reflecting the changing developmental priorities. In a typical literature approach, time is similarly spent across K through 4 on read aloud, shared writing, independent reading, etc., language comprehension skills. The two approaches also differ in how they use corrective feedback and the type of practice they ask students to engage in. Here we can see clear evidence of the different models the two approaches are based upon. When a student gives an incorrect response when reading a word in a structured literacy approach, they are specifically told to look at the word, sound it out, and check and see if the word makes sense. In a typical literature emphasis approach, students are told to think what might make sense given the topic, the picture, and perhaps, as a last resort, the first letter of the word. Reading errors that preserve meaning go uncorrected. This harkens back to the 3 cueing approach. As we have discussed, these stark differences in teaching reading have a long history and come down to different models of understanding reading. Reading as a natural derived human trait, whole language now called balanced literacy, noted as typical instruction in Moats's table, or reading as a highly unnatural behavior that we must rewire our brains through structured instruction to be able to do well. The 3 cueing system can be seen in a plethora of curriculums in schools today and is still taught in almost all schools of education. Seidenberg ends his book discussing the 3 cueing system as an example of education not embracing science. He does not blame teachers for this, but rather how they were trained and the curriculum materials they were given. He ends his book with the following quote, "Because most of what goes on in reading is subconscious, we are aware of the results of having read something, that we understood it, that we found it funny, that it conveyed a fact, idea, or feeling, not the mental and neural operations that produced that outcome. That is why there is a science of reading. To understand this complex skill at levels that intuition cannot easily penetrate." End quote. As Seidenberg articulates throughout his book, and again in this last chapter, we need teachers who are trained in the science of reading. He is more pessimistic than I am about the possibility of schools of education changing. As we talked about earlier in the class, there has been some movement and more on the horizon. In addition to knowledgeable educators, we need instructional materials that follow the science of reading. This week, you'll be sharing your reviews of different programs using the Colorado Guide, developed by our own Dr. Stoller. Guides such as these are helpful when choosing instructional materials to focus the discussion and analysis on specific instructional aspects that follow the science of reading. For the purpose of the project due this week, you are focused on one essential component and one grade level, and you are doing this on your own to become familiar with looking at instructional materials in this way. Please also think about how you might use this guide with a team of educators to choose a new program or to analyze an existing program. Please do look through the entire guide and supporting materials, all the components of reading. As you do, think about the models that guide our work. The simple view of reading, the reading rope, multi-tiered systems of support, the 4-part processor model. How does this guide help us choose programs that will create strong reading brains? The steps have already been shared with you in the Week 3 lecture. Please review that lecture, Week 3, Lecture 7, if you need a reminder of what needs to be done. The steps are also outlined in the syllabus. You're going to post your summary and rubric on a blog for your peers to read. I think you will enjoy seeing your classmates' reviews of different programs. This week was a bit lighter than the others to give you time to complete this project.